During the summer of 1867, in an isolated farming settlement outside Sedalia, Missouri, a child named Timothy Caldwell, just 8 years old, became the centerpiece of the most unsettling medical case study ever recorded in the American Midwest. Dr. Samuel Harding, the sole physician serving the region, filled 3 leather-bound journals documenting observations of a boy whose conduct defied every principle of human nature. Recognized by 19th-century medicine, the child seemed ordinary, even charming to those who encountered him briefly. Yet beneath that innocent surface lay something that the medical knowledge of the time simply had no means to explain. Over the course of 6 months, 3 people perished in accidents surrounding Timothy Caldwell, alongside dozens of farm animals discovered dead under unexplained circumstances. 11 lives, all somehow connected to a child whose smile never quite reached his pale blue eyes. Local authorities sealed the official records and concealed them for over a century. But the truth behind Timothy Caldwell reveals a darkness that calls into question everything we believed about the capacity for evil within a child. Before we go further into the story of Timothy Caldwell and the terror that seized Sedalia County, if this story has captured your attention, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And drop a comment telling us what state or city you're tuning in from. We truly love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts across the globe. The chain of events that would render Timothy Caldwell infamous began not with violence, but with grief. The Missouri of 1867 was a state still raw from the wounds of civil war. Towns like Sedalia had sent their young men off to perish on distant battlefields, leaving behind widows, orphans, and communities struggling to piece themselves back together. The Caldwell farm, tucked into a valley some 15 miles south of town, had once been a thriving operation. James and Martha Caldwell had constructed their homestead with visions of raising cattle and corn, but those visions died alongside James at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861. Martha fought to keep the farm going on her own, but consumption claimed her lungs during the bitter winter of 1865. Their son Thomas, barely 21, inherited land. He lacked the manpower to work and debts he had no means to repay. When Thomas received word that his brother William had died at Andersonville prison, leaving behind a widow and an 8-year-old son, he recognized both a burden and an opportunity. The boy Timothy would require a home, and Thomas desperately needed help with the relentless demands of farm life. Thomas Caldwell was a hardened man, made harder still by war and loss. His wife Sarah had grown sharp-tongued and bitter through their childless years. Neither was especially suited to raising a child, particularly one who arrived at their doorstep in the spring of 1866, carrying nothing but a small cloth bag and eyes that appeared far too ancient for his young face. Timothy Caldwell was slight for his age, with fair skin that burned quickly under the Missouri sun and blonde hair his Aunt Sarah kept cropped short to ward off lice. He rarely spoke of his life before the farm, offering only scattered fragments when pressed. His father had been a soldier. His mother had coughed up blood. He had stayed with neighbors for a time after she passed. What struck adults most about Timothy was his courtesy. He always said, "Yes, sir," and "Yes, ma'am." He never grumbled about work or punishment. He appeared in every respect to be the picture of a well-mannered child. Dr. Samuel Harding first crossed paths with Timothy in June of 1866, when the boy accompanied his uncle into town for supplies. Harding, a graduate of the Missouri Medical College and one of the few formally trained physicians west of St. Louis, had developed a sharp instinct for reading people during his years, treating both Union and Confederate soldiers. Something about the Caldwell boy unsettled him, though he struggled to pinpoint exactly what. The child was perfectly respectful. Harding would later record in his journal. He answered questions directly, held appropriate eye contact, and exhibited none of the fidgeting or shyness typical of rural children meeting strangers. Yet I found myself profoundly ill at ease in his presence. His gaze carried an intensity that seemed to suggest he was examining me with the same clinical curiosity I typically reserved for my patients. The farming settlement surrounding Sedalia was small enough that everyone was familiar with everyone else's affairs. The Caldwell farm was secluded, though not so secluded that neighbors failed to take notice of things. Mrs. Eleanora Patterson, whose property bordered the Caldwell land, would frequently observe Timothy working in the fields or tending to the livestock. She remarked to her husband that the boy labored with uncommon focus for a child his age, never appearing to tire, never pausing to play or rest the way children naturally do. It was like watching a little machine, she told her husband Samuel over supper one evening. He'd worked steadily from sunrise to sunset, never complaining, never slowing. Ain't natural for a boy to have no play in him at all. The Patterson farm kept chickens, and Eleanora observed that her birds grew agitated whenever Timothy neared the property line. They would huddle together, squawking and ruffling their feathers, refusing to venture close to the fence, dividing the two properties. Her husband dismissed it as coincidence, but Eleanora couldn't rid herself of the feeling that the animals sensed something about the boy that humans had missed. The first death came on a sweltering afternoon in August 1866. Little Mary Fletcher, age 5, was the blacksmith's daughter, known throughout the community for her bright laugh and her tendency to wander. She had been playing near Willow Creek, a shallow stream that wound between several properties, including the Caldwell farm. Timothy discovered her body. He appeared at the Fletcher home, just as the family was sitting down for supper, his clothes damp and his face pale with what looked like genuine distress. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, his voice composed despite his apparent agitation. "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." The search party that rushed to the creek found Mary Fletcher face down in barely 18 inches of water. Dr. Harding, called immediately to the scene, concluded that the child had drowned. A tragic but not uncommon accident in rural communities, where children played unsupervised near water. What troubled Harding was not the death itself, but Timothy's account of finding the body. The boy offered an unusually precise description of exactly where Mary had been lying, the position of her body, and the condition of her clothing. When asked how he came to be in that particular spot, at that particular moment, Timothy explained that he had been out searching for a missing calf. The boy's recollection was remarkably exact, Harding noted in his journal. He could describe the precise positioning of the deceased child's limbs, the way her dress had snagged on a submerged branch, even the color of the water surrounding her face. Such attention to detail seemed unusual for a child who claimed to be frightened and distressed by the discovery. Thomas Caldwell, when questioned, confirmed that one of their calves had indeed gone missing that morning, and that he had dispatched Timothy to search the creek area. The calf turned up 2 days later, healthy and grazing in a meadow nearly a mile from where Mary Fletcher had drowned. The Fletcher family, shattered by their loss, received Timothy's condolences with gratitude. He had, after all, been the one to find their daughter and alert them without delay. At the funeral, Timothy sat quietly beside his aunt and uncle, his head bowed respectfully throughout the service. When the family thanked him for his swift action in notifying them, he accepted their gratitude with appropriate solemnity. "I wish I could have found her sooner," he told Mary's father, his voice carrying precisely the right note of regret and sorrow. But Eleanora Patterson, watching from across the church, noticed something that gnawed at her for days after. When Mary Fletcher's mother collapsed in grief during the service, when the sight of the small coffin reduced grown men to tears, Timothy Caldwell's expression never wavered. His head was lowered in apparent mourning, but when he believed no one was watching, his pale blue eyes stayed dry and alert, absorbing every detail of the scene unfolding around him. The second death arrived 3 weeks later. Old Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian immigrant who had worked as a logger before arthritis drove him into retirement, was found at the base of a rocky outcrop known locally as Devil's Bluff. The bluff overlooked the same creek where Mary Fletcher had drowned, and Henrik was known to make regular climbs there to check on the wild beehives he tended. Once again, Timothy Caldwell was involved in finding the body. He had been walking home from town when he spotted something unusual at the foot of the bluff. "I saw Mr. Larsson's hat caught on a thorn bush," Timothy told the gathering crowd. "I called out to him but got no answer, so I climbed down to look. Henrik Larsson was dead, his neck broken from what appeared to be a fall from the top of the 40-foot bluff." Dr. Harding's examination determined that the old man had almost certainly died on impact. The only peculiar detail of the scene was the presence of several dead bees scattered around the body. Far more than would ordinarily be found away from a hive. Mr. Larsson knew those bluffs better than any man in the county. Samuel Patterson told Dr. Harding, following the examination, he'd been climbing up there for 3 years without so much as a stumble. It doesn't make sense that he'd fall now. Timothy, when questioned, offered the suggestion that perhaps the old man had been stung and lost his footing. "It was always talking about how angry they get when you disturb them," the boy said. "Maybe they swarmed him and he got turned around." Dr. Harding found Timothy's explanation plausible, but something about the scene nagged at him. The dead bees were all gathered in a tight cluster directly around Henrik's body. If the old man had disturbed a hive at the top of the bluff, there should have been far more evidence of bee activity along his presumed path of flight and fall. Instead, it appeared as though the bees had somehow been concentrated around the point of impact. When Harding ascended the bluff to examine the hives, he found them undisturbed, showing no signs of recent agitation. The worker bees were active but calm, going about their routine business of gathering nectar from the late summer wildflowers. The third death shattered any remaining notion of coincidence. In September 1866, 6-year-old Jacob Mills vanished while playing in the woods near his family's cabin. His body was found 4 days later in an abandoned well nearly half a mile from where he had last been seen. Timothy Caldwell had volunteered to join the search party. For 3 days, Timothy searched alongside the adult volunteers, displaying remarkable stamina for a child his age. He seemed to know the woods with intimate familiarity, steering searchers through areas that even longtime residents found difficult to navigate. When asked how he had come to know the terrain so thoroughly, Timothy explained that he often explored the woods during his free time, foraging for useful plants and herbs his aunt could use in cooking and medicine. On the 4th day, Timothy appeared at the Mills cabin just after dawn. "I think I found something," he told Jacob's father, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "There's an old well about half a mile north of here. I heard what sounded like crying." The well was partially hidden beneath fallen logs and overgrown brush. Jacob Mills lay at the bottom, alive, but barely conscious, suffering from dehydration and exposure. Dr. Harding was summoned at once, but the boy died within hours of being pulled from the well, his small body too far gone to recover from the ordeal. The child had been at the bottom of that well for nearly 4 days, Harding wrote in his journal. The fact that Timothy Caldwell was able to locate him in such an obscure location raises deeply troubling questions. How extensive is the boy's familiarity with the local terrain? What other hidden dangers might he already be aware of? More unsettling still was Timothy's conduct during Jacob's final hours. While the Mills family kept vigil around their dying son, Timothy sat quietly in the corner of the cabin, apparently in prayer. But Dr. Harding, positioned where he could observe the boy without being noticed, witnessed something that deeply disturbed him. Timothy was not praying. His lips were moving, but his gaze was fixed on Jacob Mills with an intensity that seemed almost clinical, as though he were cataloging every detail of the dying child's condition. The labored breathing, the ashen skin, the way consciousness came and went. When Jacob finally passed, Timothy's face showed no grief, no shock. Instead, there was something Harding could only describe as satisfaction. Following the funeral, Dr. Harding made a pretext of visiting the abandoned well where Jacob had been discovered. The location troubled him for reasons he couldn't quite put into words. The well was genuinely well concealed, hidden beneath natural debris that would have taken considerable effort to arrange. Yet Timothy had claimed to hear crying from this spot, a claim that seemed improbable given the depth of the well and the density of brush concealing it. As Harding examined the scene more carefully, he noticed something the initial rescue party had overlooked in their urgency to save Jacob Mills. Around the rim of the well, the debris had been arranged with unusual deliberateness. Logs and branches that should have fallen randomly showed clear signs of intentional placement. A natural-looking camouflage that would be nearly impossible to detect unless one knew precisely where to look. The implications were too disturbing to voice aloud, but Harding could not escape the suspicion that Jacob Mills had not simply fallen into the well. Someone had placed him there, and someone had carefully concealed the location until the boy was too weakened to survive a rescue. That evening, Harding began keeping meticulous notes on Timothy Caldwell. If his suspicions were correct, the boy posed a threat to the entire community. But suspicions were not evidence, and evidence was exactly what Harding lacked. The difficulty was that Timothy Caldwell was, by every outward measure, a model child. He attended church faithfully with his aunt and uncle, sitting quietly through services and reciting prayers with fitting reverence. He worked diligently on the farm, completing tasks that would test many adult laborers. He addressed his elders respectfully and showed proper deference to authority. Most critically, Timothy had plausible explanations for his presence at each tragedy. He had been looking for a lost calf when he found Mary Fletcher. He had been walking home from town when he spotted Henrik Larsson's hat. He had volunteered to help search for Jacob Mills, as any caring member of the community would. But Harding's medical training had taught him to look past surface appearances. In treating wounded soldiers, he had learned to recognize the signs of men who killed not from patriotic duty or desperate circumstance, but from something darker and more elemental. There was a coldness to such men, a detachment from ordinary human emotion that showed itself in subtle ways. Too little reaction to horror, too much fascination with suffering, an ability to discuss violence with clinical composure. Timothy Caldwell displayed every one of these traits, compressed into the body and face of an 8-year-old child. Dr. Harding's investigation began in earnest in October 1866. Drawing on his standing as the community's physician, he made regular calls to farms and households throughout the area, ostensibly checking on families still recovering from the hardships of war. In reality, he was piecing together a picture of Timothy Caldwell. What he uncovered painted an increasingly disturbing portrait of a child who seemed to occupy the center of an ever-widening circle of misfortune. Livestock on neighboring farms had been perishing at unusual rates. Not from disease, but from what appeared to be accidental injuries. Chickens were discovered with broken necks, seemingly killed by foxes that left no other evidence of predation. Pigs suffered mysterious wounds that festered and led to death. Horses developed sudden lameness that forced farmers to put them down. Mrs. Eleanora Patterson confided to Dr. Harding that she had lost 17 chickens in the past 2 months. "It's the strangest thing," she said. "They're dying 1 or 2 at a time, always found in the morning with their necks broken clean. My husband thinks it's foxes, but I've never seen fox sign around the coop. And the way they're killed, it's too neat." When Harding examined the most recent casualties, he found evidence that supported Eleanora's instincts. The chickens had been killed with precise force, applied to specific points on their necks. A technique that demanded considerable anatomical knowledge. It was not the random violence typical of predator attacks, but something far more deliberate and controlled. Similar patterns surfaced on other farms. James Wickham had lost 3 calves to what he described as freak accidents. Animals that had somehow managed to strangle themselves on ropes or wedge their heads in fence rails in ways that defied logical explanation. Robert Dunham's prize bull had tumbled into a ditch and broken its leg, despite being one of the surest-footed animals in the county. In every instance, the affected farms lay within walking distance of the Caldwell property, and in several cases, neighbors recalled seeing Timothy in the vicinity around the time of the incident. "I saw him walking along our fence line the morning before we found the calf," James Wickham told Dr. Harding. "Thought it was odd, him being so far from home, but the boy was always polite when he saw me, waved and called out a greeting, like he was raised proper." Dr. Harding also began paying more careful attention to Timothy's behavior during his routine visits to the Caldwell farm. The boy was invariably present during these calls, standing quietly while Dr. Harding examined his aunt and uncle for the various ailments common to farming life. But Harding noticed that Timothy observed these examinations with unusual absorption, posing questions about anatomy and medical procedures that seemed advanced for a child his age. "How do you know if someone's really dead?" Timothy asked during one visit, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping." When pressed to explain his curiosity, Timothy said he was worried about being able to help in an emergency while alone on the farm. "Uncle Thomas says, I need to know how to handle situations since we're so far from town," he explained. The explanation was reasonable enough, but something about the question unsettled Dr. Harding. There was a clinical quality to Timothy's interest in death and injury that exceeded ordinary childhood curiosity. The boy asked about the mechanics of dying, how long it took, what signs to look for, whether people could survive various types of trauma. With the same detached interest a medical student might bring to the study of cadavers. During these conversations, Harding began testing Timothy with deliberately false information, claiming certain injuries were fatal when they were not, or that specific symptoms pointed to particular conditions. Timothy never challenged these false claims directly, but Harding noticed that the boy absorbed every piece of information with remarkable retention. More disturbing still was Timothy's reaction to Dr. Harding's accounts of treating wounded soldiers during the war. While most children responded with appropriate shock or sadness upon hearing about battlefield injuries, Timothy listened with rapt attention, pressing for specific details about wound patterns, blood loss, and survival rates. "Did they scream a lot when you cut off their arms?" Timothy asked during one such conversation, his pale blue eyes fixed intently on Dr. Harding's face. "Or were they too hurt to make any noise?" The question, delivered in Timothy's characteristically polite tone, sent a chill through Dr. Harding that he would never forget. By November 1866, Dr. Harding had filled nearly 2 complete journals with observations about Timothy Caldwell. The portrait that emerged was of a child who possessed an adult's understanding of violence and death, paired with a total absence of normal human empathy. But documentation was not the same as evidence. And evidence was what Harding would need if he hoped to protect the community from what he was increasingly convinced was a dangerous predator. The chance to gather that evidence arrived when Thomas Caldwell injured his back during the fall harvest. The injury required bed rest and daily medical visits, granting Dr. Harding unprecedented access to the Caldwell household. During these visits, he began drawing Timothy into longer conversations, carefully probing the depth of the boy's knowledge and the character of his thinking. What he uncovered surpassed his darkest fears. Timothy Caldwell had been conducting experiments on living creatures for months, possibly years. Through a combination of careful questioning and direct observation, Dr. Harding established that the boy had been methodically capturing and tormenting small animals, studying their responses to various forms of injury and distress. Timothy had mentioned the cave during one of their conversations, describing it as a place he retreated to for solitude and thought. When Dr. Harding investigated the site, he found a carefully organized collection of animal bones, crude surgical instruments fashioned from farm tools, and a series of detailed drawings documenting experiments in torture and mutilation. The drawings were the most disturbing discovery of all. Rendered with surprising artistic skill for a child, they depicted rabbits, squirrels, birds, and larger animals in various stages of dissection and injury. Each drawing was accompanied by notes in Timothy's careful handwriting describing the animal's reactions, the duration of its dying, and observations about which methods produced the greatest suffering. Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes. Read one notation beside a detailed drawing of a rabbit. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after application of pressure to throat. To Dr. Harding understood that Timothy had been using the community's animals as test subjects for increasingly sophisticated experiments in cruelty. The accidental deaths on neighboring farms were in truth the result of Timothy's desire to test his methods on larger subjects. But the most chilling discovery was a newer set of drawings depicting human figures rather than animals. These sketches showed children and adults in various poses of distress and injury, each accompanied by speculative notes about human anatomy and potential methods of inflicting harm. One drawing showed a figure unmistakably resembling Mary Fletcher, the first child to die. Another depicted Henrik Larsson. A third showed Jacob Mills at the bottom of a well, with detailed annotations on the effects of dehydration and exposure on the human body. Timothy Caldwell had not merely been present when these people died. He had planned their deaths, carried out those plans with methodical precision, and documented the results for future study. As Dr. Harding would soon discover, the horror in Sedalia County was far from over. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's uncover together what happens next. Dr. Harding found himself trapped in an impossible situation. The evidence from the cave confirmed that Timothy Caldwell was responsible for multiple deaths, but that evidence had been obtained through what amounted to an unlawful search. What's more, the notion that an 8-year-old child could be a calculating murderer was so far beyond the accepted understanding of human nature that no court would entertain such a claim. The medical science of 1867 had no framework for comprehending antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. The prevailing conviction was that children were inherently innocent, corrupted only by harmful influences or traumatic experiences. The idea that a child could be born without the capacity for empathy or moral reasoning was, quite literally, unthinkable to most people. Dr. Harding understood that if he brought his findings before local authorities, he would almost certainly be dismissed as a man whose mind had been broken by too many years among war casualties. The evidence would be explained away. Timothy would be defended as a traumatized orphan acting out his grief, and the killings would go on. Instead, Dr. Harding chose to confront Timothy directly. During his next visit to the Caldwell farm, he asked the boy to walk with him to check on the livestock in the far pasture. Once they were alone, Dr. Harding disclosed what he had found in the cave. Timothy's response was not what Dr. Harding had anticipated. The boy showed no surprise, no denial, no fear at being discovered. Instead, he listened calmly as Dr. Harding described the drawings and notes, nodding occasionally as if confirming the accuracy of the doctor's account. "You're not going to tell anyone," Timothy said when Dr. Harding finished. It was not a question or a plea. It was a statement of fact, delivered with absolute certainty. "Why wouldn't I?" Dr. Harding asked, genuinely curious about the boy's reasoning. Timothy smiled, the first authentic expression of emotion Dr. Harding had ever witnessed on his face. "Because no one would believe you," he said. "And because you're curious about what I'll do next." The boy was right on both counts. Dr. Harding knew his claims would sound like the ravings of a man losing his grip on sanity. But Timothy had also identified something the doctor was reluctant to acknowledge, even to himself: a scientific fascination with observing the development of what might be the most dangerous human being he had ever encountered. "How long have you been doing this?" Dr. Harding asked. "Since I was 5, Timothy replied matter-of-factly. "Maybe earlier. I started with insects, then mice, then bigger things. It's interesting to see how different animals respond to the same treatments." He paused. "And the people who died? They were experiments too. I wanted to see whether people would react the same way as animals. They do, mostly. But they're better at understanding what's happening to them. That makes it more interesting." Dr. Harding felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "What are you planning to do next?" Timothy considered the question carefully before answering. "I need to find out what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you completely. Someone who wouldn't suspect anything until it was too late." The implication was unmistakable. Timothy was planning to kill his aunt and uncle. Dr. Harding knew he had perhaps days, possibly only hours, before Timothy acted on his intentions. The boy had disclosed his plans with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable, and past experience suggested that Timothy did not hesitate once he had settled on a course of action. That evening, Dr. Harding went to see Sheriff William Crawford in Sedalia. Crawford was a practical man who had served with distinction in the Union Army and had little patience for theory or speculation. But he trusted Dr. Harding's judgment and was willing to consider evidence regardless of how unusual the circumstances might be. Dr. Harding laid out his case with care, keeping to verifiable facts rather than psychological theory. He presented the drawings and notes from the cave, outlined the pattern of deaths and accidents surrounding Timothy, and documented the boy's unusual familiarity with anatomy and violence. Most critically, Dr. Harding disclosed Timothy's stated intention to kill his aunt and uncle. Information that could not be set aside, regardless of its source. "Even if only half of what you're telling me is true," Sheriff Crawford said, after reviewing the evidence and studying each disturbing drawing with mounting alarm. "We can't arrest a child based on drawings and suspicion, but we can watch him, and we can be ready to act the moment he makes a move." Crawford examined the anatomical precision of Timothy's sketches, noting details that even his experience as a Civil War veteran hadn't prepared him for. The two men spent hours mapping out their strategy, drawing in Crawford's most trusted deputies, men who had served under him during the war, and could be counted on to hold steady under pressure. The plan they developed was comprehensive. Dr. Harding would arrive at the Caldwell farm at his usual hour, bringing laudanum, ostensibly for Thomas's pain management, but in reality, to keep both Thomas and Sarah sedated enough to prevent Timothy from harming them easily. Sheriff Crawford and his deputies would position themselves strategically around the farm, close enough to respond quickly, but far enough away to avoid detection. The plan was set in motion the following morning. As Dr. Harding approached the farmhouse in his buggy, he sensed immediately that something had changed. The familiar sounds of morning farm life, chickens pecking in the yard, pigs grunting in their pen, were absent. The property held an unnerving quiet that made his skin crawl. Timothy appeared in the doorway before Dr. Harding had even climbed down from the buggy. The boy stood perfectly still, his pale blue eyes tracking the doctor's approach with predatory focus. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, but Dr. Harding noted that Timothy's sleeves were rolled up past his elbows and his hands appeared freshly scrubbed. The kind of thorough cleaning that suggested preparation for messy work. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his voice carrying its characteristic courtesy. But something beneath had shifted, an anticipation, an excitement the boy was struggling to contain. "I've been waiting for you." The words sent a chill through Dr. Harding. Timothy's phrasing suggested he had been expecting this visit, had perhaps even counted on it as part of whatever he had set in motion. Inside the house, Dr. Harding found Thomas and Sarah Caldwell in their bedroom, both apparently sleeping peacefully. But as he moved closer to check on Thomas, he noticed the man's breathing was unusually shallow, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that indicated something beyond natural sleep. "What did you give them?" Dr. Harding asked quietly, without turning to look at Timothy, though he knew the boy was watching his every move. "Just some herbs I found in the woods," Timothy replied, his tone innocent, but his word choice deliberate. "There are so many interesting plants growing wild around here. Some of them have very useful properties." Dr. Harding checked Thomas's pulse and found it weak but steady. Sarah showed similar signs, deeply unconscious but still alive. Whatever Timothy had used, he had been careful with the dosage. The boy wanted his victims helpless, not dead. At least not yet. "They won't be waking up for several hours," Timothy continued conversationally. "That should give us plenty of time to talk without interruption." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Dr. Harding had ever experienced. Timothy spoke about murder and torture with the clinical detachment of a medical professor discussing anatomy. He recounted his experiments on animals and humans with scientific precision, explaining his methodologies and the conclusions he had drawn from each death. "Mary Fletcher taught me that drowning is actually quite slow," Timothy said, settling into a chair, as though beginning a pleasant afternoon conversation. Everyone imagines that people simply slip beneath the water and vanish. But that isn't how it works at all. There's struggling and panic, and this fascinating pattern of breathing attempts before the person finally surrenders. I had to hold her down for almost 3 minutes before she stopped fighting. Dr. Harding felt his blood turn to ice. You held her under the water. Timothy nodded eagerly. She was playing by the creek, and I told her I'd spotted a pretty stone on the bottom. When she leaned over to look, I pushed her head down and held it there. She was so small it didn't take much strength. But she fought harder than I expected. That's when I understood that people have far stronger survival instincts than animals. And Henrik Larsson. That was more complicated. Timothy admitted. I couldn't overpower him physically, so I had to be more creative. I knew he checked his beehives every Thursday morning, so I went up to the bluff the night before and loosened some of the stones along the edge. Then I gathered bees from one of his hives and put them in a cloth bag. His eyes gleamed as he walked through his methodology. When Mr. Larsson climbed up to check the hives, I was crouched behind some rocks. I threw the bag of bees at his face and began shouting that a massive swarm was attacking him. He panicked and stumbled backward, right over the edge where I'd weakened the stone barrier. The fall killed him instantly, just as I had calculated. And Jacob Mills. Jacob was the most interesting of all. Timothy said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher sharing a particularly engrossing lesson. I didn't kill him quickly like the others. I wanted to observe what would happen if someone died slowly over the course of several days. So I persuaded him to follow me into the woods by telling him I'd found a family of baby raccoons. He paused, appearing to savor the memory. Jacob was so concerned about the imaginary little animals that he didn't think twice about the danger. I helped him climb down into the well, then moved the logs and brush to cover the opening. I visited him every day for 4 days, bringing just enough water to keep him alive, but not enough to let him recover his strength. Dr. Harding understood that Timothy was no longer speaking in hypotheticals about future experiments. The boy had specific plans, and those plans clearly included the people currently lying unconscious in the next room. What are you planning to do with your aunt and uncle? Dr. Harding asked directly. Timothy's genuine smile returned, broader than Dr. Harding had ever seen it. That's where you come in, Dr. Harding. All of my previous experiments have involved people who didn't know what was happening to them until it was too late. But you're different. You understand exactly what I am and what I'm capable of. That makes you the ideal subject for an entirely new kind of study. As Timothy spoke, he began moving through the room, gathering items Dr. Harding recognized as potential weapons. Rope from the barn, a heavy candlestick from the mantelpiece, several sharp kitchen implements. The boy arranged his tools with methodical care, as though preparing for surgery. I want to find out what happens when someone who knows they're going to die tries to save people they care about. Timothy continued, his excitement growing. Will you sacrifice yourself to protect Uncle Thomas and Aunt Sarah? Will you try to fight me, even knowing I've prepared for that possibility? Or will you try to flee and abandon them to save yourself? The daughter. Harding knew the time for conversation had passed. Timothy had revealed enough of his intentions to make clear that everyone in the house faced immediate mortal danger. He drew the pistol from his medical bag and leveled it at the boy. Step away from the knives, Timothy, Dr. Harding said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Timothy studied the pistol with interest rather than fear. That's a Navy Colt, isn't it? He said conversationally. I've seen illustrations of them in books about the war. How many rounds does it hold? 6, Doctor. Harding replied automatically, and immediately regretted the answer. "And how many people are you trying to protect?" Timothy asked. "There's Uncle Thomas, Aunt Sarah, yourself, and presumably the 3 law officers positioned outside. That's 6 people, if my counting is correct. So even if you shoot me, you'll have used all your ammunition." Timothy moved closer, no longer concerned about keeping a safe distance from the pistol. "You want to know how I became what I am?" he said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "You want to understand whether I was born this way, or whether something shaped me into it. You want to know whether there are others like me, and how to identify them before they begin killing." Each statement was true, and Timothy's ability to identify and exploit Dr. Harding's intellectual curiosity was as frightening as his capacity for violence. The boy understood people well enough to anticipate their behavior and manipulate their responses, even when they knew they were being manipulated. The confrontation came when Timothy approached his sleeping uncle with a length of rope in his hands. Dr. Harding stepped forward to intervene, but Timothy moved with surprising speed, producing a kitchen knife and slashing at the doctor's forearm. The struggle that followed was brief but violent. Timothy fought with the desperate ferocity of a cornered animal, wielding the knife with a skill that spoke of considerable practice. The boy was smaller and weaker than Dr. Harding, but also faster and more agile, and he fought with the calculated precision of someone who had studied anatomy extensively. Dr. Harding managed to seize Timothy's wrist and twist, until the boy dropped the blade, but Timothy immediately produced a second knife from his clothing. It was clear he had prepared multiple weapons and positioned them strategically throughout the house. The sounds of the struggle brought Sheriff Crawford and his deputies running from their concealed positions. They burst through the back door to find Dr. Harding grappling with Timothy, while Thomas and Sarah Caldwell lay unconscious on their bed, oblivious to the violence erupting around them. Deputy Mitchell quickly subdued Timothy while Dr. Harding caught his breath and checked on the unconscious couple. When the dust had settled, Timothy Caldwell sat quietly in the corner of the room, his clothing torn and his face bloodied, but his pale blue eyes still holding that same cold intelligence that had first unsettled Dr. Harding so many months earlier. "You can't prove anything," Timothy said as the deputies secured him with ropes. "Nobody will believe a child did all those things." Sheriff Crawford looked down at the boy with a mixture of revulsion and fascination. "Maybe not," he said. "But we don't have to prove everything. Attempting to murder your own family is enough to see you locked away, regardless of your age." Timothy smiled at that, the same genuine expression of emotion Dr. Harding had witnessed the day before. "You won't hang me," he said with absolute certainty. "I'm too young, and I'm too interesting. Someone will want to study me instead." Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sedalia County deepens. If this story is sending chills through you, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. Timothy Caldwell was wrong about his fate, but right about the impossibility of proving his crimes. When Sheriff Crawford attempted to present the cave evidence to county prosecutors, he encountered precisely the resistance Dr. Harding had predicted. The drawings and notes were dismissed as the products of a disturbed child working through the trauma of losing his parents. The pattern of accidents and deaths was attributed to coincidence, compounded by Timothy's unfortunate tendency to be nearby during emergencies. The attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell, however, could not be rationalized away. 3 law enforcement officers had witnessed Timothy attacking his unconscious relatives with clear and unmistakable intent. Even the most sympathetic observers could not argue that an 8-year-old would attack family members with a knife unless something fundamental was deeply wrong with his character. The legal system of 1867 had no established means of dealing with violent children. Timothy was too young for adult prosecution, yet too dangerous for simple placement in an orphanage or reformatory. The case created unprecedented challenges for Missouri's justice system, drawing attention from legal scholars and medical professionals throughout the region. After weeks of legal debate and consultation with experts summoned from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, a compromise was reached. Timothy would be remanded to the custody of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton, where he would be studied and treated by the most advanced alienists available in the region. The decision pleased no one entirely. Prosecutors wanted Timothy tried as an adult for murder, while defense attorneys maintained that no child so young could be held responsible for his actions. Medical professionals were divided between those who believed Timothy could be rehabilitated and those who considered him irredeemably dangerous. Dr. Samuel Harding volunteered to accompany Timothy to the hospital and remained there for 3 months, documenting the boy's behavior and collaborating with hospital staff to develop an understanding of what they were confronting. The resulting case study became one of the earliest systematic examinations of antisocial behavior in children, though it would not be published until decades after the events described. Timothy adapted to hospital life with the same calculating intelligence he had displayed on the farm. He quickly learned to mimic appropriate emotions and responses, convincing several staff members that he was making remarkable strides in recovering from his traumatic past. Timothy would weep convincingly when discussing his crimes, express remorse that appeared entirely genuine, and demonstrate what seemed like authentic gratitude for the care he was receiving. But Dr. Harding observed that Timothy was merely studying the people surrounding him, learning to manipulate them with greater effectiveness. The boy had assembled what amounted to a comprehensive catalog of human emotional responses, and he could reproduce these signals with remarkable accuracy, despite experiencing none of the underlying emotions himself. The subject displays exceptional cognitive ability coupled with a complete absence of genuine emotional response. Dr. Harding wrote in his detailed reports, "He has learned to simulate normal human reactions with sufficient precision to deceive casual observers. But extended observation reveals the performance to be entirely artificial. Timothy understands happiness as the expression people adopt when they want something pleasant to continue, and sadness as the expression people use when they want others to help them. But he has never actually experienced either." Dr. Harding's evaluation also uncovered the full scope of Timothy's violent fantasies and future intentions. When the boy believed he had earned Dr. Harding's trust by performing fascination with the scientific study of human behavior, he began sharing ideas for future experiments that made his past crimes seem almost restrained by comparison. He has developed elaborate scenarios for testing human responses to various forms of psychological and physical suffering. Dr. Harding reported confidentially. His plans reveal remarkable creativity and attention to detail, as well as a sophisticated grasp of human psychology. If he were permitted to mature and gain additional resources, he would in all likelihood become one of the most dangerous individuals in American history. Hospital records show that Timothy remained at the facility for 18 months. During that period, several unexplained incidents took place bearing the hallmarks of Timothy's methods. Other patients were found dead under circumstances suggesting accident or natural causes, but which revealed patterns of deliberate planning upon closer examination. 3 elderly patients died from apparent heart failure following interactions with Timothy, despite having been in relatively sound health beforehand. 2 younger patients suffered what appeared to be accidental falls that resulted in serious injuries. Though both incidents occurred in areas where Timothy had been observed earlier in the day. Most disturbing were reports from patients who claimed Timothy had been visiting them in the night, standing silently beside their beds, watching them sleep. Hospital staff who worked closely with Timothy also began experiencing unusual difficulties. Several nurses described persistent nightmares after spending time with the boy. Dreams that frequently featured detailed scenarios of violence and death. 2 attendants requested transfers to other wards, saying they felt constantly observed, even when Timothy was supposedly confined to his room. Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, brought in to provide additional expertise in treating Timothy, discovered that the boy had been keeping a secret journal. Timothy had persuaded one of the nurses to supply him with paper and pencil for what he described as therapeutic writing exercises, claiming that recording his thoughts and feelings would help him process his emotions more effectively. The journal appeared to contain exactly what Timothy claimed: daily entries describing his reflections, his regret over past actions, and his hopes for future rehabilitation. The writing was suitably childlike in language and emotional register, painting the picture of a deeply troubled but fundamentally salvageable young person struggling to overcome traumatic experiences. But Dr. Fitzgerald's training in European psychiatric techniques included familiarity with coded communication systems. When she applied analytical methods to Timothy's journal, she discovered that the innocent seeming entries concealed a sophisticated cipher. The decoded messages revealed Timothy's true thoughts and designs in disturbing detail. Rather than experiencing remorse or undergoing rehabilitation, he was conducting a systematic study of the hospital, its staff, its routines, and its security procedures. His goal was not merely escape, but to use his period of confinement to develop more advanced techniques for manipulation and murder. Day 47. Dr. F believes my tears during today's session were authentic. Read one decoded entry. Her response pattern indicates increased sympathy and reduced suspicion. Estimate 3 more weeks of consistent performance will be required to establish sufficient trust for physical contact during sessions. The discovery of the coded journal led to an immediate tightening of security procedures and a reduction in Timothy's contact with hospital staff. But Timothy adapted to these changes with characteristic flexibility, shifting his attention from manipulation to information gathering about hospital routines and potential escape routes. In the summer of 1868, Timothy Caldwell vanished from the Missouri State Hospital under circumstances that were never fully explained. The official investigation concluded that he had somehow slipped away during a transfer between buildings, despite being under constant supervision by multiple guards. Dr. Harding suspected that Timothy's escape had been far more elaborate than the official report indicated. The boy had demonstrated remarkable patience and planning ability throughout his confinement, and it seemed probable that he had spent months laying the groundwork for his departure. Evidence uncovered after Timothy's disappearance suggested that he had been manipulating the facility's staff far more successfully than anyone had recognized. Several guards reported having made small accommodations for Timothy in the weeks before his escape, allowing slightly longer exercise periods, providing extra reading materials, making minor adjustments to his daily schedule that seemed harmless individually, but may have collectively created the conditions for escape. He spent 18 months studying that facility and the people who worked there. Dr. Harding wrote in his final report on the case. By the time he made his move, he understood the psychology of every person on staff better than they understood themselves. His escape was not an act of desperation. It was the culmination of a carefully executed plan. In the months and years following Timothy's disappearance, Dr. Harding began collecting reports of suspicious deaths and accidents from across the Midwest. Many of these incidents bore hallmarks consistent with Timothy's methods. Carefully staged accidents resulting in death, evidence of systematic animal torture, and the presence of a child who seemed unusually helpful and emotionally mature. The challenge was that Timothy would now be older, potentially strong enough to overpower adult victims, and certainly sophisticated enough to avoid the missteps that had led to his original capture. His period of intensive study in human psychology, combined with his natural intelligence and total absence of moral restraint, had produced something without precedent in American criminal history. Dr. Harding devoted the remaining years of his career to tracking these reports and working toward a comprehensive understanding of what Timothy Caldwell represented. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1891, contained hundreds of pages documenting cases that might have involved Timothy, alongside theoretical reflections on the nature of evil and the possibility that certain individuals might be born without the capacity for moral reasoning that we consider fundamental to human nature. The broader implications of Timothy's case continued to shape discussions about criminal justice, child psychology, and mental health treatment for decades after his disappearance. His ability to deceive trained professionals raised troubling questions about the reliability of psychiatric evaluation. His manipulative gifts highlighted the potential dangers of assuming that all children are inherently innocent and capable of redemption. The Caldwell farm was abandoned after Thomas and Sarah recovered from their ordeal. Neither could bring themselves to remain in the place where they had unknowingly harbored a killer for nearly 2 years. The property eventually reverted to the county and was sold to developers in the 1890s, though local residents avoided the area for decades afterward. The cave where Timothy had conducted his experiments was sealed by Sheriff Crawford shortly after the boy's arrest, but its significance was never forgotten by those who knew what it held. Local legend held that the cave was cursed, and that animals refused to graze in the surrounding fields. Dr. Harding's journals were donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1923 by his daughter, who believed that the scientific value of her father's observations outweighed concerns about the disturbing nature of their content. The journals remain in the Society's archives, available to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest in the development of psychological understanding. Thomas and Sarah Caldwell never spoke publicly about their experience with Timothy, but both lived under assumed names for the rest of their lives, apparently fearing that the boy might one day return to finish what he had started. Sarah died in 1889, and Thomas followed in 1894. Neither ever had children of their own. In his final journal entry, written just days before his death in 1891, Dr. Harding reflected on the broader meaning of Timothy's case. I have spent 24 years attempting to understand what Timothy Caldwell represented, and I fear I have arrived at a disturbing conclusion. Timothy was not an aberration. He was a glimpse into what human beings might become when stripped of the moral and emotional constraints we consider fundamental to our nature. If he survived to adulthood, then somewhere in America there walks a man who understands human psychology more deeply than any trained professional, who can manipulate people with uncanny skill, and who regards the rest of humanity as nothing more than subjects for experimentation. This mystery reveals that evil can wear the face of innocence, and that our assumptions about childhood and human nature may be dangerously misplaced. The case of Timothy Caldwell compels us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of moral development, and about the possibility that some individuals may be born without the capacity for empathy or conscience that we consider essential to what it means to be human. What do you make of this story? Do you believe everything has been brought to light? Or might there be more to Timothy Caldwell's fate than the official records let on? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and share your perspective on this disturbing chapter in American history. If you enjoyed this story and want more mysteries like this one, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves puzzles as dark and complex as this. Remember, the truth is often more terrifying than fiction, and history holds secrets that continue to challenge everything we think we know about human nature. See you in the next video.